Welcome everybody to our community of practice for this March 12th Tuesday, and thank you for joining us. I will let Jessy get started with our framework for information literacy.
Sure. So I feel a little bit like I'm speaking into a vacuum because we had such a robust conversation going before I had to duck out for a couple months. And now I'm stepping back in. So let me know if we've covered this already, or and just what you're working on and how things have progressed. But starting to shift our focus from the Research Skills Development Framework to the Framework for Information Literacy put out by ACRL, really we want to go back to the beginning. So we're asking the very same questions, right, that we've been asking all along, which starts to feel redundant. Why are students struggling with research and information literacy skills? What's getting in the way of their learning? And then on top of that, how would you even know if they were getting it? How are you making visible what they maybe are learning? How are you measuring their success? And we're just going to look at that from a different lens. So we've looked at it through RSD, and now we're going to look at it through Framework for Information Literacy. So we're going to start this the same way we started last September, and the same way that Sylvia and I always start when we present, partially because it's very cathartic for faculty and librarians. But what are your students maybe still not getting? And this doesn't have to be earth-shatteringly different from maybe how you're answered in September. What are they struggling with?
So Harry, what do your students struggle with?
I would say the biggest thing that I'm finding is this whole concept of literature search. I think once they get in the field, because I'm field-oriented, that starts rolling, and then they can see what previous students have done on presentations. But this whole idea of literature search and using that to ground the research and then use that in the discussion later on.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty advanced.
Shauna, how about you?
So one of the things that continues to be kind of funny when we think about our modern students, we think about them as being very tech savvy. You know, they can use Snapchat filters, and I don't know how familiar any of us are with that kind of stuff. I don't know Snapchat at all. But, you know, they use Amazon every day. They know how to search in Amazon, narrow down their results, etc. To me, they're still very uncomfortable using the actual tools that they use to find scholarly materials and interpreting results in those tools. So, you know, there are very boring, dry tutorials that we can do for getting them familiar with those tools. But on my end, as an instructor, I really struggle with trying to get them engaged in those kinds of trainings and those kinds of getting them familiar with the tools. So that's something that I see from students. A comfort, a familiarity with the actual databases and the actual tools.
Okay.
Kristen, do you have any input?
Yeah, I can definitely tag on to what Shauna just said. And what I notice very much in particular is using the tools effectively to get relevance. You know, they'll still be looking at a screen at 30,000 results, no matter how many times I tell them there's a whole bunch of ways not to do that. So very superficial use of the tools, but not really utilizing what they offer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. Renee, do you have any insights from your perspective?
Thank you. So I was just going to echo or reinforce that my concern for the superficial use of tools and for how we struggle to get students to go into a deeper learning and to utilize them that way.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we'll move on then.
Oh, showing the big reveal. So here's an activity that we often do in person. It's based on Tom Wojak's Got a Wicked Problem, First Tell Me How to Make Toast. It's a TED Talk. And it's all about design thinking. Is that right? Am I getting that right, Sylvia?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So what we usually do is we hand out Post-it notes, and we have participants write one step on each Post-it note. So imagine that you're assigning a research project to your students. Librarians, you might have to get out of what you actually do and maybe imagine how if you had one ring to rule them all and control over a classroom, how you might do that. So imagine you're assigning that research project to your students. Think of all the steps and the instructions that you're going to give them. So it might be slides you use in class, it might be in the assignment prompt itself, in discussion, in your LMS, maybe you set some sort of reminder, but think of all the steps and instructions you'll give them to set them up for success, and take a couple minutes to just list out those steps. So we're gonna have you do that in your own space, in your own head for a minute, and then we'll summarize it together. And Sylvia, maybe you wanna go into editing mode on the next slide. Would you be willing to type out?
Okay, thanks, Jessy.
Yeah, thank you.
How's everybody doing? Are you ready to move forward?
I see heads are still down. Now, if you've been using the RSD or starting to implement the use of the RSD, this list might be shifting around for you, and that's okay, right? That's part of this transformative process where we've been hoping to journey on together this year. All right, why don't we get started, even if it's unfinished?
Who wants to give us some steps?
I guess I usually start off with what their interest is in, what they're interested in, what type of research in the context of the research team. And then I ask them, A, to read a previous proposal or why they're interested in that area, and hopefully meet or do some background literature. But more and more, I'm directing them to Hans, the librarian I work with, and just say, go meet with this individual to flesh out some of your ideas.
Who else wants to share?
I find that having a short reading as a prompt for ideas is super helpful. So kind of related to what Harry said, but usually I try to use, because I teach lower level introductory library sessions, something more in the popular media dealing with a potential research issue.
What's the next step?
Having them document the whole kind of question formulation, brainstorming, keyword, search term generation through some sort of worksheet, and then suggesting a specific tool or database to try out the searching in, and then collecting and documenting the resulting information. That's pretty much, as a librarian, that's kind of as far as I take it.
Somebody else want to go?
I can share. I was thinking about the assignment that we often get as librarians, that students will receive: research a topic in databases, find scholarly sources, write a paper. And some of the overlap with Kristen's ideas, encouraging students to learn about their topic using popular resources, things they're already familiar with, Google, Wikipedia, YouTube, blogs, so that they have an understanding of their topic before they, go into the database and use that background knowledge as keywords in the database to find scholarly sources. So once they're in the database, learning how to use the broad searches and then using filters to narrow it down, and understanding what they're seeing in the database. What do things look like? Why is something scholarly? Why is something popular? You know, one of those could be an entire session, an entire 40-minute session. Why is something scholarly? What do scholarly materials look like in a database? Because a lot of times we get students not understanding what they're seeing.
Okay, good. So thank you. I think we've got some good things to start with, so let's.
I will say, I know there's more here. And because we're a librarian heavy group today, we're seeing a lot of emphasis on the embark and clarify and find and generate stage, right? That's pretty normal for librarians. I'm guessing, Harry, because you see a whole progression, you probably have more directions that you give around some of the other stages, some of the other facets in the RSD. But I'm making an assumption.
Yeah, I think our end goal is always, I mean, for here, Student Research Day or presentation at the conference.
Mm-hmm.
So the end goal is that, you know, communication and taking a look at there. I think what we lack is, and from what I'm hearing and some of the people saying that, is the whole idea of that literature search. But I think discussing the results is often lacking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's coming from the lack of understanding of the literature search and what that actually means and how you can tie those models that you gather out of the literature search and then put that into the discussion to reflect on the data that you collected. And so it's some interesting ideas of going back. I'm just throwing out an idea here of going back to the librarian once the data is collected and they're analyzing the results, to take a look at more in-depth topics in the literature search to get papers that are out there that would better reflect the models that collected or the data they have in place, because now they know what they're looking for.
So you're starting to brainstorm around analysis and synthesis, right? So this tool, even the RSD as a reflective process, is already showing us maybe things that we assume a student can do, but they're actually invisible. We're not necessarily supporting, structuring, or scaffolding those steps for students. All right, Sylvia, do you want to show what your students experienced?
So what I did with my students is I started to try and take a look at where they were coming from. So what I started to do is ask students what research looked like, and I asked them this when I started my research project, and then I asked them to do this again at the end. And what I asked them is, can you please draw what research looks like or feels like for you? And because they all tell me that they've done research, and when I ask them what that was, they refer back to the research papers they've done, but they don't really get that they're doing research out in the field, or much of the assignments that their university professors are giving them are actually inquiry-based and go find things, go think through things, etc. So this is what research looks like for my students. They basically are on a computer looking for information. Sometimes they might go to a book, and you can see that they also think up their own ideas. And this feeds into what I see in that they're experts on everything because they get lots of information, but they don't necessarily know how to wade through it. And so for them, it's pretty literal. You can see upper left corner, Google is their go-to application for all answers. They do mention the Stout Library and scholarly articles and peer-reviewed journals. That's for people, the left drawing comes from students who've had an ed psych class or something where they've had to research. But this is what it looks like for students, and it's find articles, look on the computer, write something, and we're done. So that's where my students are coming from.
Mm-hmm. So looking through the, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Jessy.
Oh, I was just looking through the lens of RSD and now looking through the lens of FIL. What we want to expose in ourselves is our expertise blind spots.
So the thing that both the RSD and the FIL have done is help expose these expertise blind spots that that I have as an instructor. So as we take a look at ourselves and turn a lens on ourselves, we are all experts in our field. So we make a lot of assumptions, and it's based on this idea that we have a large amount of knowledge. We're experts because that's how we got to where we are. We have a well-organized schema, a well-organized image of what all of this information looks like for us. And we've had this intense and long-term practice. Even if you are fresh out of grad school, you know, you've spent years looking at a particular topic. And as an expert, you're able to make connections. You're able to organize information into patterns. And it's hard to understand or to remember what it was like not to have that knowledge and not to have those connections, because those connections are made for you. And so I find myself frequently lumping steps and lumping things together because I've moved beyond that base, beyond being a novice, and I don't know how to go back to that. So I've got this expertise blindness that I'm working with.
And that's not just in the realm of your content knowledge, which is more obvious to us because that's what we're trying to teach in the classroom. It's actually in the realm of the processes that you use, the tools that you use around that content knowledge. So your research skills and your information literacy skills are also part of our expertise blindness. So what does this kind of look like for students? Well, it looks like Sylvia said, she's often lumping things together because it doesn't have to be scaffolded for her anymore. And so she can go through the cognitive processes that are necessary to accomplish a task without even thinking about it. But the cognitive load for students is pretty high. So here's a pretty typical list of tasks that students have to do at the beginning. So this is just the embark and clarify. This isn't even dealing with the rest of the RSD facets, right? You have to construct and employ search strategies, choose and use search tools, access the full text sources, and decide when you've obtained enough information. That's like the very basics of what you have to move through to start a research project. Well, if you flip to the next slide, Sylvia, each one of these tasks that we often just hand to students has a pretty robust set of cognitive and dispositional tasks underneath it. So to be able to construct and employ search strategies, you have to be able to clarify and scope a research question in relation to a problem or a question. You have to envision which contributors or stakeholders, which voices might relate to that topic of inquiry. You have to anticipate where those stakeholders would communicate, and you have to predict what language they would use in order to have that organized and be able to pull it out in something like a database. So that's just one of the tasks that we ask them to do. And then if you go to the next slide, what are the things they have to know, do, believe, and feel in order to do those things? So they have to know the purpose of different communication genres. They have to understand that scholarship is done in conversations, and there's a lot of ways those conversations can take shape. They have to understand that maybe it's iterative, that you don't just search one time. And then there's things that they have to believe and feel in order to do it well, which sometimes we stumble over these things, not even realizing that they're you know, we kind of come up against their resistance and we don't know why. Maybe we're coming up against a belief or a feeling that they are not yet ready to embrace. It's something like comfort with ambiguity and just persistence. In order to do that successfully. So the cognitive load is actually pretty high for those freshmen. And if it's not scaffolded well as they develop, there's going to be big gaps in their skills. And by the time they're seniors, they might be able to do one or two things well, but they're still maybe struggling to put the whole picture together. Okay, so I think that moves us into actually starting to deal with what the framework for information literacy can do for us in our reflective mode. So the first thing you need to know is that the Association of College and Research Libraries used to have basically a list of learning objectives, of standards that students had to meet in order to be information literate. Some of those standards, they're still out there and they're still relevant. They're still useful, I should say. But about 2015, after long discussion and critique of just trying to move students through these hoops, skill hoops, the librarian field started trying to identify what's actually holding, what are the connecting pieces, like the ligaments, right, that are making it, that are invisible right now and making it difficult for students not to be able to actually do those skills. So they started looking at, from the perspective of a theory of threshold concepts. So it's important to understand what threshold concepts are and how the theory works before you actually can take the frames and invoke them, use them well. So threshold concepts is a learning theory. I would say it's more of a philosophical learning theory than maybe like a cognitive psychological learning theory. That's okay. It's just one lens to help us. So Myers and Land, they said that in any field, there will be like foundational concepts, foundational ideas, that once someone has understood that idea, they are these things. So that idea is transformative, and they talk about it like thinking like an expert. So us librarians, there are certain concepts that once we understood it, it just opened up the whole world of information for us, right? They're transformative. It's what sets us apart from someone who's not an expert in that. It's the same in your fields, Dustin and Harry. There are things that it's when your world got blown wide open, and you start to even assume the identity of that field. You start to able to say, like, I'm a physicist and this is what differentiates me from someone who's not a physicist. Those ideas are irreversible. Once you understand them, you can't understand them. Okay, they become like a part of you. They're bounded within typically a knowledge framework, and that idea is not necessarily it's not transferable to other systems. You might be able to transfer it via some sort of like linking metaphor, but the idea itself, the concept of itself, doesn't necessarily act in another system. It's integrative, means that idea, once you understand it, opens up for you to be able to see all these links between ideas in that knowledge system. And they're often troublesome. They don't have to be troublesome, but they often are. So when students are coming up to, or even we were coming up to approaching one of those big ideas, and our teachers were like, are you gonna get it? Are you gonna get it? Oh, not this time. How about now? Are you going to get it now? And waiting for us to cross that threshold. It's typically something that's kind of hard to grapple with and grasp. Not always measurable. So can you think of, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, can you think of one threshold concept in your field and share it?
For me, I tried this with my students, so I'll get us started. For me, one of the things that I did is I used the framework for information literacy and I had my students go take a look at a literature search, but I also explained to them why I wanted to do that, and I put it in the context of you're about to embark on a conversation with other experts. And I'm not having you do this just because it's a hoop to jump, but you're going to do this research project. You're going to go have a conversation with other scholars, and at the end of your research project, you're going to add to that conversation, and they can come back and talk to you as well. And it's not like you're going to sit across the table from them, but you're going to have a conversation via printed word or video presentation, etc. For me, that was an aha moment, because I got to recognize, for me, what the research process was all about. But it was also interesting to watch my students go, oh, so the reason I'm not just going to one source and doing this is so I can have this conversation. And I had some students articulate it, and I had other students who were like, yeah, I just don't get it yet. So that was interesting to watch, both for me and for them.
So for me, you're invoking the framework, Sylvia, in a teaching situation, but I'm thinking, and mine will overlap with the framework because of my background. When I was in grad school and I started to understand some of the issues around information privacy and human rights, I started to understand that information has an ethical component, and that is not something that I think I realized going into grad school. It kind of blew my mind that facet of information was there and was such a big deal.
So because I'm teaching mostly introductory classes right now, the one that's standing out to me is the difference between velocity and acceleration. That, we think so colloquially when we use those terms, you hear acceleration, you think, oh, that if something has a lot of acceleration, that means it's fast. And if something if something has a lot of velocity, then that also means that it's fast. But they're actually very different concepts. So acceleration means a change in velocity. So when something is speeding up or slowing down, then it has an acceleration. And getting students to separate those terms is a challenge. I don't think that, I don't think it hits all of these check marks. I don't think that when students suddenly realize the difference between acceleration and velocity, they suddenly feel like they're physicists, but they do feel like they're getting physics better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I have a feeling one of the threshold concepts maybe attached to that is separating the substance from a state change. I don't know if I'm describing that correctly, but separating, so one describes the other. They're not the same thing. One is a state change. This is a novice trying to reflect back to you.
The difference between a value and a change in a value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That shows up a lot. And I think that's something that students learn really well in calculus. And the fact that I'm teaching a class that doesn't have calculus makes it much more challenging to teach, because they're not as used to talking about values and changes in value.
I think that's a great example of something that dances around the threshold concept range. Cool. Anybody else want to share? Okay, so librarians got together and started asking the questions, what are the threshold concepts for information literacy? What are the things that if someone just understood that, they would be able to navigate so much better? They'd be able to do the steps of those facets, right? They'd be able to embark and clarify more savvily. They would be able to analyze and synthesize better. They would be able to do it more complexly with more nuance. And here are the 6 they come up with. came up with. And I really encourage you to go and read the original document. And part of that is because the original document actually lists out for each of these knowledge practices and dispositions. And because they're listed out in nice bullet points, those are very helpful when you start establishing your learning objectives around supporting research and information literacy skill development, because they are things you could visibly look for.
And I've actually sent in assignments, I've sent my students to that framework to look at the dispositions so they know what kinds of things they should do. Here, you're starting a search. We're going to be looking at this particular frame in the information framework, and here's the skills and dispositions you ought to be able to do, at least some of them, maybe not all of them. Pick one that you can relate to and tell me how you're growing there. So I actually intentionally send my students there to look at it.
I don't know if I would do that for freshmen.
Maybe not freshmen. I've got sophomores.
Yep.
But I
work in a highly reflective environment. You have established a highly reflective environment. But yeah, they're helpful. The original document is definitely helpful. I'm going to go through and just describe each one of these. I'm hoping to finish. I'll just let you know in about 10 minutes I need to pop out for a client meeting. But Sylvia, she's been doing this so long with me, she's fully capable of wrapping up.
I'm partially capable.
I just want to say, if you want to have a deeper discussion around some of these or look at an actual assignment, I'm happy to schedule a meeting. So, okay, so the first one, and I shouldn't say first, second, third, they are interconnected ideas. They're not ordinate at all. But the first one we're going to look at today is information creation's process. If students could understand that information creation is a process, they would understand how they could use information in a much more nuanced way, right? So this is like different formats have different value in different contexts. So they would be able to choose genres and formats to actually match their information need. And if they get more advanced, they would even understand that those genres and formats are very flexible in and of themselves and would bring a different value. So this is kind of mitigating that idea that you just dump search terms into Google and Google knows everything and it just gives you back this factual information, right? To understand that information is actually created, and it's created based on a lot of originating motivations for a lot of diverse reasons, just blows the whole thing wide open. All right, next one. Research is inquiry. So this group has really, really focused on struggling with research as inquiry. So thinking about information in terms of solving a problem or answering a question. In general, understanding that disciplines, so we're trying to invite them into this world of knowledge disciplines, that disciplines are all organized around answering questions. And that some of those questions have like very accepted answers, but some of those questions are very contentious, right? So there's a big spectrum to the information around those questions. Things like disagreement, that there's debate and there's dialogue. This will also draw into the next one. So scholarship is conversation. The idea that, again, we're not just running a research project and discovering a new law of nature every time we research, right? That it's a discursive process, that it's all about questions and ideas being formulated, debated, using different tools in order to make phenomena visible. There's competing perspectives. So a lot of times I really try as a librarian in the classroom to help them understand that the references list or the works cited list is not simply so that people don't get caught plagiarizing, but they're actually entering in the middle of that conversation, and the works cited page is how they know where they're at in the conversation. Authority is constructed and contextual. We would love to think that experts are always experts in every context and they're infallible. That would be lovely. But it's not that way. So authority is a social construct as well as like a knowledge construct. It's a little bit more complex than simply you got a PhD and so you are an authority on XYZ. So being able to understand how authority is constructed and how some voices get marginalized for different reasons, being able to respect expertise. So a lot of times when people discover that, they go to the other end, like nobody is right ever and nobody is an expert, which is just as troublesome in the field. But being able to get to that really mature place of respecting expertise, but being very skeptical of the systems that establish expertise, being able to critique those systems. And being able to predict on the search end what types of expertise you need for your need, because it's not always the same type of expertise that you need. All right, next one. Information has value. So different manifestations of value. We hear a lot about like publishing, right, and open ed, and the value discussions around that. But also, kind of like I mentioned earlier, like the value around personal information and how it's bought and sold and used. Typically, students start running up against it when they are taught about citation and plagiarism. But going deeper into that discussion about the value of information and the nuances surrounding that really helps them navigate and make good choices and really become like a participant in that discussion. And then the last one is the one that we think of most often as information literacy. And if you go back to the original standards set by the ACRL, many of them are stuck in the searching as strategic exploration. It's still a threshold, right? We're still seeing students struggle with choosing databases, coming up with keywords. Some of the reason why they're struggling with that has to do with some of these other thresholds as well. But much of it just simply is the tolerance for ambiguity, being able to engage in iterative process, being able to use a pre-search and use that information to construct more advanced searches. So being able to navigate those issues. Okay, so how can you use these two things together? When you look at the RSD facets, it's very linear. It's much more observable, and because it typically has to do with the steps we list for students. First, you choose a topic. Then you go find sources. Then you take a look at your sources, hopefully, right? And you get the ideas you need out of those sources to answer your question, do your project, whatever. You're gonna have to organize and manage those sources in order to accomplish that. You're gonna have to hopefully analyze. That's an oft skipped one because it's really hard. It's hard to do, it's hard to teach. And then you're gonna communicate those sources, or you're gonna communicate your endpoint, your information point. The framework for information literacy helps us maybe to understand why they're not moving up. Actually, if you can go to the next slide, Sylvia. Why they're not moving up in autonomy in any of those areas. It's not the only reason why they're not moving up in autonomy, but it can be an invisible reason why they're not increasing their maturity and skill in some of these areas. So using it as another reflective tool to diagnose why students are struggling, but then also to build, so we talk about scaffolding, right? So if you want students to move from red to orange, we know that it has to be scaffolded some way. Some students more than others, but there needs to be support. That's developmental learning theory. So how do you scaffold? Well, part of it might be concentrating on the threshold concept that's maybe holding them back from being able to function and move up in their skill in that area. So we talk about it being a little bit more integrative. Okay, I am going to jump out.
All right. So
Thank you for letting me go through that so quickly. I will be back in 2 weeks, and you can tag me anytime. But Sylvia, I'll let you wrap up with.
Thanks, Jessy.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jessy.
Bye, everybody.
Good luck. Thanks. We'll be in touch, Jessy.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Bye.
Okay, so your assignment for this upcoming week or next 2 weeks is to take a look at your students again through the lens of the framework for information literacy. So describe a struggle your students have doing research, and then diagnose that struggle in relation to the ACRL framework for information literacy. And you can think about starting with this statement. So if students understood what in the framework for information literacy, then they could do what in the RSD facet. So you're trying to connect the framework for information literacy and the RSD facets. So basically, I had to take a look at my assignments, and I gave the example of scholarship as a conversation. And then I was hoping that if they understood that, then they could maybe go do a literature search with a little more care, or be more willing to spend some time doing it and then actually read the articles that they found. So that's one example for me. So what you're going to do is find 2 different items and then describe how the 2 are interdependent, and then think about what makes your statement true. So we'll be taking a look at that. If you could get that posted by the 24th, we'll be taking a look at that in our future meetings. Questions about that? For next time, our current module is up and running, and our next module will start in about 10 days on March 22nd, and our next meeting is on March 26th. Before we leave, is there anything you folks want to discuss or talk about? Questions you have?
No, the most difficult concept was the parting statement that Jessy had said. So it's just absolutely perfect that the assignment will help me struggle and address with that. So.
Yep, and yes, you will. I was struggling. I'm still struggling, but it's a really interesting struggle. It's fun to see. Dustin, do you have questions?
No specific questions, just trying to get used to, thinking in a different way.
Yep, now that we got you used to one way, we're going to throw another one at you. Congratulations. Shauna, are you okay?
Yep, yeah. I think just kind of processing it, and probably at the same place where Kristen is as well.
Sure. Renee, how are you doing?
So I just wanted to say that it was several years ago that I learned about threshold concepts relative to faculty development, and through the work of many of my colleagues throughout the UW system. And for me, that was one of those aha moments where I had never really intentionally thought about it. So it's a wonderful exercise, and as always, Jessy did a fabulous job of explaining the literacy. So that was wonderful. So good to be with all of you. Thank you.
Yes, it's nice to see you. Harry, are you? I don't know. Is Harry? Are you still on or no?
Harry's not on anymore.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I didn't see him, but thought I'd ask. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, that wraps it up for this week, and I can see you online in another couple weeks.